My parents lied about my disability to steal my $150K college fund. Now they're paying it all back. Yes, family betrayal. The lie that shaped my life. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed deafening as I sat across from Dr. Mercer. Watching her scan through my medical records with furrowed brows, my palms were sweaty, and my heart pounded in my chest. At 21 years old, I was finally about to learn the truth that had defined my entire existence. "Well, Alex," she said, removing her glasses and meeting my eyes with a puzzled expression. "I've gone through all your historical records, conducted our own assessments over these past weeks, and consulted with specialists. I can say with absolute certainty that you do not have, nor have you ever had, the neurological condition your parents described." Time seemed to stop. The room spun around me as 18 years of my life. All the limitations, all the special accommodations, all the "you can't do that because of your condition" conversations suddenly revealed themselves as an elaborate facade. "But my parents always said—" My voice trailed off, my throat constricting with emotion. "I understand this must be shocking," Dr. Mercer said gently. "But there is no evidence of any cognitive or developmental disability in your brain scans or your performance on any of our tests. You're completely neurotypical, Alex. You always have been." The revelation hit me like a tsunami. All those years of being told I couldn't attend regular school because my condition would make it too stressful. All those years of being homeschooled in isolation. All those years of being discouraged from applying to colleges because it would be too much for me. All lies. But why? What possible reason could my parents have for fabricating such an elaborate deception about their own child? The answer, as I would soon discover, was as simple as it was devastating. 150,000. The discovery that changed everything. I left Dr. Mercer's office in a daze, my mind racing with questions and possibilities. For as long as I could remember, my parents had told me I had a rare neurological condition that made me susceptible to stress and overstimulation. They said it would cause episodes if I pushed myself too hard. They claimed doctors had diagnosed me when I was 3 years old, too young to remember. This supposed condition was why I had to be homeschooled, why I couldn't play sports, why I couldn't go to sleepovers or birthday parties, why I had to take special supplements every day that made me drowsy and compliant, why I needed to stay close to home under their watchful eyes. It was why, when high school graduation approached for kids my age, my parents gently explained that college wasn't in the cards for me. "People with your condition just don't do well in those environments," my father had said, his hand on my shoulder. "But don't worry. Your grandmother set up a special fund for your future, and we're managing it for you." My grandmother. The thought of her sent a jolt through me. Before she died when I was 8, she would often talk about the college fund she had established for me. "You're going to do great things one day, Alex," she'd say. "This money will help you chase your dreams, wherever they take you." After her death, my parents became the trustees of that account. I had nearly forgotten about it over the years, as college became an increasingly distant possibility in the narrative they had constructed for me. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone and called my Aunt Sarah, my mother's sister and the only family member who had ever seemed to question my parents' handling of my condition. "Aunt Sarah," I said, my voice cracking, "I need to ask you something important. Do you know anything about the college fund Grandma set up for me?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Alex, she finally said, her voice cautious. I've been waiting for this call for a long time. Meet me at Riverfront Park in an hour. There are things you need to know. The painful truth. The autumn air was crisp as I sat beside Aunt Sarah on a park bench overlooking the river. The colorful leaves swirled around us, a stark contrast to the cold reality she was unveiling. Your grandmother set up an educational trust for you when you were born, she explained. By the time she died, it had grown to almost $150,000. It was meant to be used exclusively for your college education or vocational training once you turned 18. But my parents said I couldn't go to college because of my condition, I said, still struggling to process what Dr. Mercer had told me earlier. Aunt Sarah's face hardened. Alex, I've had my suspicions for years, but I could never prove anything. Your grandmother was a smart woman. She made your parents the trustees, but with conditions. If you didn't use the money for education by the time you turned 25, they could legally access it for themselves. The realization washed over me in a wave of nausea. They invented a disability to steal my college fund? I think so. She nodded grimly. After your grandmother died, they suddenly became much more restrictive about your condition. They pulled you out of the private tutor sessions you were thriving in. They started talking about how you couldn't handle stress. They isolated you from everyone, including me. But what about the doctors, the diagnosis? I pressed. Did you ever actually meet these doctors? See any medical reports with your name on them? I tried to remember, but couldn't recall ever visiting specialists or undergoing tests. Just my parents' stories about appointments that happened when I was too young to remember. And the medication? I asked, thinking of the daily pills that always made me feel foggy and tired. I can't prove anything, Aunt Sarah said carefully, but I strongly suspect they were giving you something to make you seem more manageable, more in line with the condition they claimed you had. My mind flashed to the times I'd tried to skip my supplements and suddenly felt more alert, more alive, only to have my parents attribute my increased energy to an oncoming episode that required doubling my dose. But why didn't you say something? I asked, anger rising in my voice. Aunt Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I tried, Alex. God knows I tried. But your parents had documentation they showed the family, papers they claimed were from doctors. They cut me off when I raised too many questions. I even called Child Protective Services once, but your parents had everything in order for the caseworker who visited. After that, they barely let me see you. She took my hands in hers. I started saving money for you years ago, hoping that one day you'd discover the truth. It's not much. Just about $25,000, but it's yours when you're ready. As we sat there, the magnitude of my parents' betrayal settled over me like a suffocating weight. They had stolen my childhood, my education, my independence, my relationships, my options, my trust, all for $150,000. Confronting the architects of the lie. For 3 days after meeting with Aunt Sarah, I stayed in the cheap motel she helped me check into, processing everything I had learned. I couldn't face going back to my parents' house. Not yet. Not until I had a plan. I spent hours researching the neurological condition my parents had claimed I had. I learned about trustees and educational trusts. I contacted Dr. Mercer and obtained copies of my recent medical evaluations. I even found a lawyer who specialized in trust disputes and offered free consultations. By the time I was ready to confront my parents, I was armed with knowledge, evidence, and a determination I'd never felt before. It was a Sunday evening when I finally returned home, knowing they would both be there. My mother's face lit up with relief when I walked through the door. "Alex, we've been so worried. You can't just disappear like that without telling us where you're going. With your condition—" "Stop!" I interrupted, my voice steady. "We need to talk. Both of you. In the living room. Now." Something in my tone must have alerted them that something was different. They exchanged a quick glance before following me into the living room. "I saw a neurologist," I said without preamble once we were all seated. "Dr. Mercer at University Medical Center. She ran comprehensive tests. There's nothing wrong with me. There never was." The color drained from my father's face. My mother's hand flew to her throat. "That's not possible," my father said. "Those doctors don't know your history." "What doctors, Dad?" I challenged. "Name one. Tell me when I saw them. Show me a single authentic medical record with my name on it from before this month." Silence fell over the room. "Why would you do this?" I asked, my voice finally breaking. "Why would you lie to me my entire life? Make me believe I was sick, keep me isolated, stop me from going to school, making friends, having a normal life?" My mother started crying, but I noticed there was more fear than remorse in her eyes. "We were protecting you," she insisted. "The world is dangerous, and it's—" "Stop lying," I shouted, slamming the folder of medical documents on the coffee table. "I know about Grandma's trust. I know about the $150,000. I know you become eligible to take it for yourselves if I don't use it for education by the time I'm 25. I know everything." My father's expression changed then, from defensive to calculating. "Alex, you're upset and confused. Let's discuss this when you're calmer. Maybe you need to take your medication and—" "You mean the sedatives you've been giving me to keep me compliant?" I shot back. "No more. The lies end today." I laid out my demands clearly. They would transfer the full amount of the trust, which according to my research would now be worth closer to $200,000 with accumulated interest, to a new account in my name within 24 hours. They would sign a notarized confession about their deception. If they refused, I would take the evidence I had gathered to the police and file charges for fraud, medical abuse, and embezzlement of trust funds. "You can't prove anything," my father said coldly, his mask of concern completely gone now. "It would be your word against ours. We have years of documentation." "Forged documentation," I countered. "And I'm not bluffing. Aunt Sarah has kept records of her concerns for years. I have Dr. Mercer's evaluation, and I'm prepared to have the medication you've been giving me analyzed in a lab. Are you ready for a police investigation into what substances you've been giving your child without any medical necessity?" The standoff lasted late into the night. They tried everything. Gaslighting me about my memories, threatening to have me committed for a psychotic break, even attempting to invoke their authority as my parents, despite the fact that I was now legally an adult. But in the end, it was the mention of potential media coverage that broke them. My father, a mid-level executive at a pharmaceutical company, couldn't risk the publicity of a trial. "Fine," he finally said around 2 a.m. "You'll get your money. But after that, you're on your own. Don't expect anything else from us ever again." I looked at these people, these strangers, who had raised me in a web of lies, and felt nothing but a hollow ache where love had once been. "That's all I want," I said. the money that was meant for me, and the freedom to never see either of you again. Building a life from scratch. The next morning, I watched as my father made the necessary calls to initiate the transfer of funds. My mother sat silently at the kitchen table, alternating between tears and cold stares. By afternoon, I had proof that $198,742.35, the full amount of my grandmother's educational trust, plus accumulated interest, had been transferred to the new account I had opened. With Aunt Sarah's help, I found a small apartment across town and moved out that same day, taking only my clothes, my laptop, and a few personal items. Everything else felt tainted by the life of lies I was leaving behind. The first weeks of freedom were both exhilarating and terrifying. Without the medication my parents had been giving me, I felt more clear-headed than I could ever remember, but also had to learn to manage normal anxiety without chemical dampening. Simple tasks like grocery shopping or riding a bus. Things my parents had convinced me would trigger my condition were challenging but ultimately liberating. 3 months after my dramatic exit from my parents' home, I was sitting in the office of an admissions counselor at the local community college. "Your situation is unusual," the counselor admitted, looking over my paperwork. "No high school diploma or GED, no standardized test scores. But your placement test results are quite strong." I had spent weeks preparing for those placement tests, determined to prove that despite my lack of formal education, I was capable of college-level work. "We can admit you provisionally," she continued. "You'll need to complete a GED program alongside your first semester courses. But based on these results, I don't anticipate that being a problem for you." Walking out of that office with my first college schedule in hand was perhaps the most vindicating moment of my new life. I was registered for 5 classes, including an introductory psychology course that I hoped might help me understand what had driven my parents to such an elaborate deception. That first semester was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Without the foundation of a normal education, I had to work twice as hard as my classmates to keep up. I spent hours in the library, teaching myself concepts that others had learned years ago. But I was motivated by a fire my parents had never anticipated: the determination to reclaim everything that had been stolen from me. By my second semester, I had earned my GED and was maintaining a 3.9 GPA. I had made friends. Real friends. Not the carefully monitored, appropriate interactions my parents had occasionally orchestrated. I joined study groups, participated in campus activities, and even started seeing a therapist to process the trauma of my upbringing. The 180 sin in on 40,35 from my grandmother's trust, along with Aunt Sarah's $25,000 gift, gave me the financial freedom to focus entirely on my education. I was careful with the money, knowing it needed to last through whatever educational path I chose. I lived frugally in my small apartment, worked part-time at the campus library, and applied for every scholarship I qualified for. By the end of my first year, I had discovered a passion and talent for computer science, a field my parents had actively discouraged, claiming screen time would trigger my non-existent condition. The irony wasn't lost on me. The unexpected consequence. 18 months after walking out of my parents' house, I was thriving in ways they had never allowed me to imagine. I had transferred to a 4-year university on a partial scholarship, declared a computer science major with a minor in psychology, and built a small but solid support network of friends and mentors. I had no contact with my parents during this time. As far as I was concerned, they no longer existed. The wound of their betrayal was still too raw, too deep for any consideration of reconciliation. But life has a way of forcing unexpected confrontations. I was leaving the campus center one evening when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Hello, is this Alex Mercer?" a formal voice asked. "Yes, it is. This is Springdale General Hospital. We have your father, Richard Mercer, in our emergency department. You're listed as his emergency contact. He's been in a serious car accident." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Despite everything, my first instinct was concern, followed immediately by anger at myself for caring at all. "How serious?" I asked, my voice wooden. "He's in critical condition. The doctors are taking him to surgery now. Your mother is on her way, but we thought you should be notified as well." I thanked the caller and hung up, then stood frozen on the sidewalk, unsure what to do. Part of me wanted to ignore the call entirely. Why should I care what happened to the man who had systematically robbed me of a normal childhood for his own financial gain? But another part, a part I wasn't entirely comfortable with, couldn't simply walk away. 3 hours later, I was sitting in a hospital waiting room, as far from my mother as the space allowed. She had barely acknowledged my presence when I arrived, just a curt nod before returning her attention to her phone. Fine by me. The surgeon finally emerged, looking tired but satisfied. "He's stabilized," she told us. "The next 48 hours will be critical, but barring complications, he should recover. He has multiple fractures and internal injuries, but nothing that won't heal with time and physical therapy." My mother visibly relaxed. I felt nothing. Or rather, a complex tangle of emotions too contradictory to name. As I turned to leave, having done what some vestigial sense of duty required, the surgeon added, "The police are investigating the accident. Apparently your father crossed the center line. They're waiting on toxicology reports, but they suspect he may have been impaired." My mother's head snapped up. "That's ridiculous. Richard barely drinks." "Not alcohol," the surgeon said carefully. "The responding officers found prescription bottles in the car, several different types of anti-anxiety medications and sedatives. Not all prescribed to him." The irony hit me with almost physical force. My father, who had spent years sedating me under the guise of treating a fabricated condition, had apparently been self-medicating with similar drugs. The very same class of drugs he had used to keep me compliant and convincingly disabled had now nearly killed him. I left the hospital without another word to my mother. But as I drove back to my apartment, a strange thought took root. What if my parents' deception hadn't been solely about the money? What if there had been mental illness in our family all along? Not mine, but theirs. Justice and healing. 2 weeks after my father's accident, I received an unexpected email from a legal firm representing my parents. My first instinct was to delete it, assuming it was some attempt to reclaim the trust money or silence me about their deception. But curiosity won out, and I opened it. The email contained a formal letter of apology and an offer of additional financial compensation for the psychological and educational damages I had suffered. Attached was a signed confession from both my parents, admitting to fabricating my condition to gain control of my grandmother's trust. I later learned that my father's accident had triggered an investigation that uncovered his long-standing issues with prescription drug abuse. Facing potential criminal charges for driving under the influence, as well as the possibility that his medication issues would lead to questions about my upbringing, My parents had decided to get ahead of the situation with a formal acknowledgement and settlement offer. The confession was comprehensive. They admitted to creating false medical records. They admitted to giving me unnecessary medication to make me appear to have the symptoms they were claiming. They admitted to isolating me to prevent outside parties from questioning their narrative. They admitted that their original intention had been to access a portion of the trust funds to address their own financial problems, but that the deception had spiraled into a years-long commitment that became increasingly difficult to back away from. Their lawyer proposed an additional settlement of $300,000 as compensation, along with an agreement that I would not pursue criminal charges or speak publicly about what they had done. I forwarded the email to the lawyer I had consulted during my initial confrontation with my parents. After reviewing everything, she advised me that while the confession was valuable, the proposed settlement was inadequate given the extent of damage done to my educational and psychological development. "They're trying to buy your silence cheaply," she explained. "The potential damages in a case like this, with their written confession, could be much higher, and they know it." With her help, I countered with demands for a $750,000 settlement, full coverage of my ongoing therapy costs, and a requirement that both parents undergo psychological evaluation and treatment. I had no interest in sending them to jail. What would that accomplish? But I wanted accountability and assurance that they couldn't do something similar to anyone else. The negotiations lasted months. During this time, I continued my studies, maintained my near-perfect GPA, and even started dating someone. Normal life experiences that still felt novel and precious to me after years of isolation. Eventually, we settled on $600,000, a structured therapy payment plan, and a requirement that both parents complete treatment programs. My father for his prescription drug issues, and both of them for the psychological factors that had led them to maintain such an elaborate deception against their own child. The money wasn't the point for me, though it did ensure that I could complete not just my bachelor's degree, but potentially graduate studies as well without financial stress. What mattered was the acknowledgement. The validation that I hadn't been crazy or paranoid in questioning the narrative they had constructed around me. The confirmation that the limitations I had lived under for 18 years had been artificial constraints, not inherent disabilities. Rising from the ashes of betrayal. 3 years after discovering the truth about my condition, I stood on stage in a cap and gown, accepting my bachelor's degree in computer science, with minors in psychology and ethics. I graduated summa cum laude, Latin honors that recognized academic excellence I had been told was beyond my capabilities. In the audience sat Aunt Sarah, beaming with pride, along with friends who had supported me through this journey of self-discovery and healing. My parents were not present. By mutual agreement, we maintained only minimal contact through our respective lawyers. The settlement money, combined with what remained of my grandmother's trust and scholarships I had earned on merit, had funded not just my undergraduate education, but had been carefully invested to support my upcoming graduate studies. I had been accepted to a prestigious master's program in artificial intelligence ethics, a field that fascinated me partly because of my experiences with manipulation and control. As I moved my tassel from right to left, symbolizing the completion of my degree, I thought about the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. If my parents hadn't been exposed, I would still be living in their house, believing myself incapable of the achievements I had now realized. I would never have discovered my passion for technology ethics or experienced the simple joy of academic accomplishment. I would never have known what it meant to live independently, to form genuine relationships, to trust my own mind and abilities. The betrayal had been devastating, but the freedom that came after had been worth every painful revelation. I had lost the parents I thought I had, but I had found myself in the process. Later that evening, at a small celebration dinner with Aunt Sarah and my closest friends, I received a text message from an unknown number. It contained just 4 words. "We are truly sorry." I didn't need to ask who it was from. I simply turned off my phone and returned my attention to the people who had supported me without conditions or deceptions. The future stretched before me, limitless in a way I had never been allowed to imagine during those constrained years. Where once there had been artificial boundaries created by lies, now there were only the natural horizons of my own choices and abilities. The clock that had once seemed to be ticking down on my options was now marking time on a journey of my own making. The fear that had been carefully cultivated in me had been replaced by confidence built through actual challenges overcome. The money that had been the object of my parents' deception had ultimately funded the very independence they had tried to prevent. Sometimes justice arrives in unexpected ways. Sometimes healing comes through the very wounds that were meant to constrain us. And sometimes, the greatest revenge against those who would limit us is to simply become everything they said we could never be. As I looked around at the life I had built from the ashes of betrayal, I finally understood what my grandmother had meant when she told me I would do great things. She had provided not just the financial means for my education, but through her legacy, the impetus for my liberation. The trust had been broken, but in its breaking, I had found my truth.